Welcome to the Relational Approach Podcast. I'm your host, Deborah Bakhti. I think you're going to enjoy this conversation with Dr. Keller Wood. She shares a perspective through the educational lens and specifically the Montessori approach. And we talked about how it really relates to a relational approach in seniors care. You're going to hear her talk about her passion for alignment as it relates to work-life balance, because let's be real, there isn't really such a thing called work-life balance, but if we can focus toward alignment, we can make better progress. She also has this expression of the cosmic tasks that we have, which really speaks to purposeful work. And we know in seniors care, it's very purposeful work, providing care and support to residents and to their families and to each other as care team members. And she'll also touch on a bit about this internal-external shift and ways that we can really reclaim agency in our lives, particularly when we feel like things are out of control. So I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Hi, Katie. Welcome to the Relational Approach Podcast. I'm so excited that you've joined us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Deborah. I appreciate being with you today.
Yeah, well, I'd like to start by, if you can just share a little bit about who you are, what you do, and also where you're calling in from today.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. So I am Dr. Keller Wood. I have spent most of my life and career in the world of education. I like to say I grew up in the world of education. And my journey has taken me from teaching in traditional environments, conventional environments, into learning about and then teaching in Montessori environments. In the Montessori world, if people have heard of Montessori, they usually know about it for little kids, but my experience has always been actually for the older students, adolescents, middle and high school students. So my journey took me into the Montessori classroom, and then from there into teacher education. And now I run one of a handful of Montessori secondary teacher education programs. I also serve as an instructor at the University of Virginia, and I have become so passionate about the application of Montessori ideas, not just to the world of education and for young children, but also to our lives as adults. I've seen it certainly change my life and the lives of many of the teachers that come through our training program. I didn't have a Montessori education. Most of the teachers who come to Montessori training didn't have a Montessori education. And yet many of us have found in this framework, in this philosophy, applications that have really, changed our lives as well.
I've had the opportunity to have some really engaging and interesting conversations with you over the years as we've talked about the work I do in seniors care and the work that you do in education. And I thought it would be a really interesting opportunity to have you on the podcast because your TED Talk, which we'll include a link to, you talk about alignment with work-life balance. And as I'm sure you can imagine, in healthcare, the pushback to that would be, what are you talking about? There is no work-life balance. And I wondered if you could share a little bit of your story about your sister that you shared in your TED Talk, because it's so relevant to the listeners and the work that we do here in seniors care.
Yeah, thanks. I'm happy to. And I agree, we've had so many lovely conversations, and one of the things that I'm struck by in the parallels between our work is that we're often trying to bring together groups that are really on the same side, but who maybe don't always see it that way, right? So what you've explained to me about your work in partnering families and providers, I see very similarly with, teachers and education providers and families, right? And that, at the end of the day, we are on the same side. And many of us chose our work because, we're good at it. We love it. There's something about our unique brand of magic that we get to bring. And while we do that, we get to make a difference in the world. And so we're passionate about our work. Many of us, our work is not the only way we could have earned a paycheck, right? We chose our work for a reason. And yet I think that when that's true, it's been true in my life, it's been true for my sister, and I'll share about her in just a second. that we can also, really feel pulled because we love our work and we want to give ourselves to it. And yet we don't want to lose ourselves completely to our work either, right? So society sets up this framework of, well, all you need to do is figure out a little bit of like work-life balance, right? And so to me, that sets up this idea of like, there's some kind of giant scale with work on one side and life on the other. And we're supposed to figure out like what amount of life is going to be the correct like counterweight to our work. And I reject that idea because I think at the end of the day, we're whole people, and what's happening in our work lives is going to impact what's happening in our non-work lives and vice versa. So, my sister, and the story that I tell in the TED Talk, my sister works in healthcare. She is an oncology nurse. She works inpatient at a major university-based hospital in the United States. And she had been practicing as an oncology nurse for acute oncology and stem cell patients for almost a decade. And she, it's hard work, no doubt about that. She loves her work. She's always loved her work. But she called me and she got to the point where she was like, Kate's like, how do you know when it's time to quit your job? And I had known that she had been having a little bit of a hard time. They had been chronically understaffed for a while, and her work was hard. But my heart really sank and really broke in that moment for her because I know that she loves her work, and she had not gotten to the point where she was really asking that question before. It had always been, how do I advocate for myself, or what could I tweak? But now she was really thinking about walking away. And what struck me in that moment, where my mind went, was I could picture the fridge in her apartment. I was able to share space with her for a little while I was in graduate school, and her apartment fridge is just covered with thank you notes from patients, and sometimes from their surviving family members. So I knew that her work was important. I knew that she was good at it. I knew that she was passionate about it. And what I thought in that moment was, what happens when someone like my sister Abby chooses to walk away? What about all the patients that she, will never get to see? And I think it's true, in education as well, that when, there's an amazing teacher who chooses to walk away from that profession, the cost is hard to understand. It reminds me of the butterfly effect from chaos theory, which maybe you're familiar with that. But the idea poetically is that when a butterfly flaps its wings, it causes a hurricane on the other side of the world. And I think about, those of us who love our work and who are passionate about our work, the impact that we have and the ripple effects of that, we'll never know. So to me, this is not just a, do I stay? Do I go? Oh, it doesn't matter. I think it does matter. When I talk to teachers who have left the profession, not all of them, but many of them are quite wistful. They often say, I loved the kids. I loved teaching. There were so many things about it. If only XYZ had been different, if only this thing had been different, maybe I could have stayed. And so my book, Alignment, is about, helping us think about our work and our lives as parts of our beautiful life mosaic. I don't think we're trying to balance them. I think we're trying to arrange and rearrange all the important pieces of our lives in our beautiful life mosaic, so that the pieces are where we want them to be. And that's what alignment means to me, that alignment is when the pieces of our lives are in the correct and appropriate relative positions, whatever that looks like for us.
So how does the Montessori approach fit into this work?
It's both an educational pedagogy, right? It's a practice that you'll see with very specific things for children and in classrooms. But it's also a philosophy. It's also a framework. And so one of the things that learning about Montessori really changed for me was my conception of what work even is. there's a variety of nuances to a Montessori perspective of work that I tease out in my book. But one of the stories that always comes to mind for me is a friend of mine, my friend Heather, shared with me the story of a little boy named Max. And Max was relatively new to her Montessori school. He was probably 3 or 4. And Max's dad came in for parent-teacher conferences. And Heather said, how's it going? Max is a delight to have in class. How are things from your perspective? And the dad was like, I'm so happy that Max loves his Montessori school. He's happy to come in the morning. He seems to be adjusting well. Everything's great. But there is one strange thing that has happened, and it's not great. And that is that, like, on the weekends, before anything has really even happened, Max just seems to wake up and burst into tears. And I don't understand it. Like, I love weekends. Like, weekends are family time. Like, this is the best. And here's my son, and he's crying, first thing in the morning. It seems like every weekend. And so Heather, asked a few more questions and, started to probe a little bit deeper. And eventually the dad, sort of revealed that he also had a habit, as a family, just to celebrate that, hooray, it's the weekend and it's family time. He would wake up and say, hooray, hooray, no work today. And Heather said, oh, I see the problem. And she explained to Max's dad that, here in our Montessori school, all of the interesting and engaging things to do are not called toys. They're not called manipulatives. They're called works. And so for Max, there was no distinction between the work and the play, right? And so, when his dad would announce, no work today, to Max, it might as well have been like, no fun today, right? And I just love that story because I think, so many of us as adults, and certainly the lesson that I learned was work was the opposite of play. And yet I don't think that's even been true in my life. I've had days teaching that were just as joyful as joyful days on vacation, if I really think about it. Now, not every day is that way. But I do think that there's a beauty in adopting a Montessori perspective of work. So that's one aspect, that work and play don't have to be opposites, that they can go together. I'll share just a couple more ideas about work, but another one is that our work is important, it's meaningful, and our work is what connects us to the rest of the world. So the idea is that every single entity in the entire universe has a job to do. So young children in Montessori classrooms learn, for example, that the job of the wind might be to circulate and to purify the air. And so they learn about, just different jobs and different ways that things in our universe kind of work together and contribute to each other, which leads to, students starting to wonder, and what would be my job? What is my role? In Montessori terms, we talk about this as discerning cosmic task. And so as students move into adolescence and adulthood, they start to ask, who am I, right? That work of identity is so important for our adolescents. But then how do I contribute? And how do I give back? And what does that look like in the world? And our work is often how we do that. Montessori has almost this perspective of work I like to think of as our purpose work, right? Our cosmic task is what we are here to do and be right now in the wider world. And that may, for many of us, for me it does, overlap with also our paycheck work. But our society, pretty much, when we talk about work, we're only talking about our paycheck work. I think Montessori has a bigger idea of what work is. And so her idea of work is really purpose work, which again, may have overlap between our paycheck work and our purpose work, but it doesn't have to. I do think that many of us who work in education, who work in healthcare, who work in other kind of so-called service professions, did choose our work in at least a small part, if not a large part, to be of service to the world. So those are a couple ideas about Montessori.
Yeah, what I was envisioning, it's almost like a zoom in, zoom out, because when we have those days that we feel mired in the mundane,
Yeah.
right? So in a senior's care home with all of the tasks, that transactional part of the work that needs to get done, and you could get to the end of the day and just feel like all you've done is that work of those mundane tasks, and yet not also zooming out to see what's the big picture impact here, right?
Yeah.
Because it particularly if you think about anybody working on the front line in an organization can feel like a cog in the wheel, and yet they are the ones that can have the most impact in with the resident, with the family,
Absolutely.
within the work that they're doing. So to me, this cosmic task is a bit of that overlay,
Yeah.
like a touch point. It's
Yeah.
almost asking ourselves, why am I doing this work again?
Yeah.
Is that
Yeah, 100%. And I think, the idea that Montessori said all work is noble, right? So she didn't draw a distinction between the person who makes a diagnosis or prescribes the medicine and the person who is changing the sheets and providing comfort or bringing food or water, right? Like all work is noble. All of it matters. And in fact, like you said, it's often that human interaction that means the most to people, right? I know that when I have been sick, when I have needed a hospital stay, my heart was overwhelmed with gratitude for the people who came and took care of me in the moments that I couldn't take care of myself, right? Like I needed those people. And when they were able to see my humanity and to honor that and to treat me with dignity, I was incredibly grateful, right? That work, whatever it may be just helping me to the bathroom, maybe, changing linens, that mattered.
Mhm.
And that was deeply impactful to me.
So going back to the story with your sister,
Yeah.
because it sounds like she had hit a point of overwhelm, burnout, and was looking to make a significant decision. I'm
Yeah.
going to assume that there's a happy ending in the story and that through the lens of alignment, you were able to help shift her perspective.
Yeah. So when she called me that day, we kind of were talking through like, okay, what's hard, what's going on. But there was another element to that story too, and that was the timing of it. So when my sister called me, yes, the hospital was short staffed. Yes, the work was overwhelming. But it was also the fall of 2020. And so we all know what life was like in the fall of 2020, particularly for those who worked in healthcare. Um, and so I said to her, I said, Abs, your work has always been hard. And she agreed. And I said, do you think it would be just as hard if, some of the other pieces of your life hadn't had the dramatic shift that they had, right? So she hadn't seen her immediate family in months. Her gym had closed, her days off had been lonely. And she even unfortunately had to say goodbye to her best furry friend. So it wasn't just that work was harder, it was that the other pieces of her life also weren't supporting her healthy alignment in those moments. So she had some soul searching to do. It wasn't easy. I don't want to paint the picture of like we had this conversation and then she was like, okay, thanks, Kate. And like off she goes and life is great. No, it was hard. It was hard for a long time. She had to spend a lot of time with who she is, what she wants in the world, what's important to her. There was a lot of journaling. There was a lot of long walks. The pandemic, didn't lift for several more months, right? Like, life didn't start to return to normal for quite some time. And she did make some shifts in her profession. She decided to explore travel nursing for a little while, still in oncology, but seeing how things work in different hospitals and in different settings. She was really grateful for those opportunities in that it gave her perspectives of how things work in other places. She also decided that what she loved most about her nursing practice was the one-to-one with her patients. And, in a hospital setting, in an inpatient oncology hospital setting in particular, there isn't a lot of time for how to support that person holistically. Nurses are trained to support the holistic person, the whole person. She's trained in nutrition. She's trained in, all of these different elements. And yet, in the few minutes that she had with each patient, there often wasn't adequate time to really talk them through, okay, when you go home, here's what to expect, here's what things might look like. She would only see patients for just that particular part of their cancer journey. So she decided to go back and be certified in nurse coaching as well. And so now she is back at that same hospital in a part-time capacity while also practicing as an oncology nurse coach. And so that for her has been, the most joyful way to stay with the profession that she loves. She wasn't ready to walk away from the hospital in the clinical setting, but also to support the pieces of that that she most loves in a deeper way, which is the relational part.
Right.
And so she does that through her nurse coaching.
So that sounds like you've made reference to, I think it was in your TED Talk, and I'm sure it's in your book, the internal shifts and the external shifts. And what I was hearing from that was she was able to do a bit of an external audit of what's going on, what's within my control, what are the things that I'm not able to control. And then that internal audit is the alignment to what's important to me, why does this matter, what do I need, and recognizing the other elements that are going on in her life that were contributing to it. Because I think it's probably fair to say that a lot of people working in healthcare, and I'm sure the same could be said for education, are feeling the overwhelm, the burnout, the stress, the fatigue. And we know that we don't necessarily make the best decisions when we're feeling depleted.
Mm-hmm.
And as human beings, we want to have a sense of agency, a sense of control. So It sounds like this Montessori flavor can help with guiding that inner reflection. And I keep using the word audit, but an assessment, the levers that can be pulled.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And Deb, it's so interesting because, my first conception of the book was actually about systems, right? Because as individuals, we're all part of these larger systems. And I think that systems have some responsibility. So if you're a hospital administrator, I think there's things that you can do to support the healthy alignment of the people who work in your organization, right? The same is true, I think, for any organization. But at the end of the day, a book is typically for individuals. And what I found in my life and in my work is that, we often have much more control than we think. So sometimes it is the right move to quit your job, right? And I don't think anyone should stay in a position where their humanity is in any way not recognized, in any place where, there's abusive things happening, right? Like, there are times when it is non-negotiable. Do not stay in a position where, you're belittled, you're demeaned, et cetera, right? But I think often we set ourselves up to say, it's either stay or go, without teasing out what could make it possible to stay. Sometimes when work is not working, when work is hard, when work is, particularly challenging, we're not always thinking about, what else in our lives maybe is or isn't supporting our work in the way that it could, right? And so this idea, I like the word audit. I don't use that word in my book, but I love it in terms of, it's really about a deep noticing. It's about, spending time with yourself. Is the issue with my work pieces of my life? Is it with the non-work pieces of my life? Where do I want to, and maybe it's both, right? Maybe there's things that I want to shift on both sides. But when I figure out, kind of where I want to focus my energy, then I can ask myself, okay, is this an internal shift? Is there something I can change all by myself? Is it changing a habit? Is it changing my self-talk? Is it changing my routines? Is it learning a new skill? Is it something that I can do, something that I can control? Or is it something that is outside of my control, but perhaps I can advocate for, right? I don't think that just because you can't make the change all by yourself, doesn't mean that we're powerless, right? And so I think, very often when we start to advocate for the changes that we need, that helps everybody, right? I think that, you're probably not the only person who's having this particular struggle. And so I think that we can work together to create healthy working environments for everyone.
Just to shift gears a bit, you drew the correlation between education and healthcare with educators and parents.
Yeah.
And in our world, it's care team members and families.
hmm
So, how does the Montessori approach help your teachers to be able to build more of a relational connection with the parents?
Yeah. So that's a great question. I think that parents and families are an integral part of the model. Um, for the most part, our families are choosing, a Montessori education for their children. Montessori, certainly the majority of Montessori exists in private and independent schools, both in the US and in Canada. But there are public Montessori schools in the US and in Canada. And so whether or not families are choosing it, I still think that there's a responsibility of trying to form partnerships, trying to make sure that we're on the same page. But what I think is really lovely about the Montessori approach is that it really does provide this sort of holistic framework of the main emphasis in a Montessori education is on developing the whole child. The idea being that Dr. Montessori believed that education could be a vehicle to help each individual child, student, grow into the fullest, most flourishing version of themselves. And Dr. Montessori believed, living through the world wars, that in fact, this was a vehicle to a more peaceful, more just world, that everyone, kind of growing into the fullest and best version of themselves could in fact lead to world peace, which is kind of incredible vision that she had. And so I think that, in the partnering that we have, if we're all serving the whole child, very often I would say to families, I am an expert in this age group. I know adolescents. I have taught hundreds of adolescents. I know exactly what is typical for this age. And yet you are the expert in your child, right? I don't know your child. You have lived with your child for the years that they have been on our planet, right? And so we need each other. We need each other's perspective because, this may be the first time that you're dealing with a 14-year-old, whereas I have hundreds of them, in my experience, but I've never worked with your child. So remembering that at the end of the day, that we're all on the same team and that we have this holistic vision of what is best, what does this human being need to flourish, really brings us together. And so I would think that in your world, that it's very similar, that the family knows their person, they know who they are, what they need, what makes them happy, what brings them joy. They know, who they've been. They know their whole story. Right. And so we need each other so that as the care team is working to meet the needs of that person, knowing that, they were an avid gardener might make a huge difference in, how you can interact with that person. Right. So I think that the partnership can be very similar.
I love that, Katie. And what was running through my head was that for the family, this is the first time that they're experiencing their dad as an 82-year-old with
Yeah.
cognitive decline. And yet
Right.
the care team members have dealt with hundreds, if not thousands, of 80-ish-year-old residents with cognitive decline. And
Yes.
I don't think that I've ever thought of it that way when I think about my parents and their aging process, that it's the first time that I'm dealing with at that age and stage. And
Mm.
certainly, the relational approach in seniors care is coming together with the shared common goal of providing the best quality of life and experience for that resident who is the loved one's family member.
Yeah.
And what you're describing with Montessori is that holistic approach that centers around the student or the resident and coming together as a team.
Yes, yes, yes. And I mean, just as a quick aside, I know you know this, we've talked about it before, but I have been so thrilled. I'm not an expert in this, but there's also been some applications of Montessori and those works, those materials in elder care and for adults with dementia in particular. So there's some really interesting research coming out of that, that applies actually the pedagogy, not just the philosophy like I've been talking about, to the work that you do. But leaving that aside, I think that this philosophy of, at the end of the day, we want to support the most flourishing of this human being and take care of all of their needs, right? Their physical needs, their emotional needs, nurturing their spirit, whatever that looks like for that person in our care. And making sure that they're getting, all the things that they need to be as well as they can be at this stage in their life.
Well, and ideally, what ripples out from that is that the families can have an improved experience as a family member, because this is the first time that they are likely coming into a seniors care community and being a family member. So that's a whole new role for them.
That's
And
right.
the other impact, as we've been talking about earlier, for the care team members in being able to feel alignment with the work that they do and why they do it. And we understand that in any job, there's going to be the mundane tasks that need to get done. But this
100%.
overlay of understanding that that's a part of it, but the bigger picture is the why this matters. And as you say, that cosmic task, which equals
Yeah.
purposeful work.
Yeah. That's exactly right. That's exactly right, Deb.
So, in wrapping up, I like to ask my guests, what does a relational approach mean to you?
Thanks. I think the relational approach to me is all about recognizing our deep interdependence, right? So I have some unique gifts to bring to the world. I have some things to offer. I have some responsibilities, and I am not an island. I need the work of others. I need everyone else to step in and to do their part, right? So I have my cosmic task. I have the work that I try to move forward in the world, but I don't do that alone. I don't think any of us work in isolation completely. And so the relational approach to me means recognizing that deep interdependence, and appreciating the work product and the humanity of the others with whom I come into contact.
Well said. Thank you, Katie. Thank you so much for joining me on the
Thank you for
Relational
having
Approach
me.
podcast.
Yes, it's been a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the work that you do in the world, Deb. And so thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us on the Relational Approach podcast. If you're enjoying this topic, I invite you to check out my website, deborahbakti.com. And when you click on the resources tab, you will be able to access a whole bunch of free resources that I would love for you to enjoy. You can also check out these episodes on my YouTube channel. And if you haven't already, make sure that you subscribe on your favorite podcast platform.